and it may be something you could actually finalize today if the committee feels comfortable with what we're proposing. You know, the Benefits and Service Committee has a variety of for lack of a better term, policies with respect to the setting of contribution rates and interest rates for the various programs, the DB program and CB and DBS. And the committee's actions are based on those policies, but they're not memorialized in any single place, such as the board policy manual. So what we are proposing in this item is to basically incorporate all of those policies and then any future revisions in the board's policy manual, so they're all in one place people can refer to and see what it is. So we identify in the item itself what the draft language would be, and those are all consistent with the existing policies that the committee has operated under, including the changes that were made over the last year around having a single year of age for the service credit. And as you look at additional policies over the next few months with respect to the valuation, how you do the valuation, the additional earnings credits, those can also be incorporated into this section. So so we're recommending, if the committee is comfortable just moving forward with it, you could act today to adopt these policies, and then they will be reflected in the benefits and services portion of the policy manual. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have about this item.
All right, Ed, I don't have anyone in line as of yet. I do have a couple. So you're talking about actually adding more to this in the next few months as we start to have those discussions?
As you would make decisions around what the policy should be in those other items, they would be incorporated into this.
Right. Would it be worthwhile to, well, let me ask you this first. Does this then go to the board governance committee?
I don't believe that was the plan, no.
It would just go straight into the board policy manual from us? Okay.
Well, it would go to the board and they would vote on it. Just
Right.
And then it would go.
But it's not like it has to be reviewed through the process that we're already doing in board governance.
Right, and then in terms of those future policies, the action that you would take to adopt the policy would include the fact that it gets incorporated in the policy manual, so it's not like there's multiple steps for that.
Alrighty, and then my second, you started the conversation by talking about that the information that we would be putting into policy is not necessarily memorialized anywhere else. And I was actually wondering why we would have language in the policy that talks about what historically had been instead of just what was as a policy.
That's valid. I mean, it's been memorialized in terms of each item in the past when there's been an item to adopt the rate, we've identified that history, but it certainly wouldn't be, I think that's perfectly reasonable if you want to just simply have what the current policy is. That would be fine.
All right, I'll let the rest of the committee weigh in on that. Personally, I think that our policy should be clean.
Okay.
And should be just what is, not necessarily what has happened historically. And then when we revisit those items, when the write-ups, we talk about what has historically been done. But let's see what the rest of the committee feels. So Paul, you have a question?
Yeah, so I'm a little confused what we're doing here. So let's just take on the number one, the regular interest rate. So this is just putting into the board policy manual what we already do,
Yes.
which is annually we adopt a regular interest rate.
Mm-hmm.
And that will still do that. The
Yes.
board will still do
Yes.
that. Okay, so it's really just taking what we're doing, moving it formally into the board policy
Correct.
manual, but not changing anything that we're
Correct.
doing. So what is it that you're referring to you'll be coming back and adding to?
No, you are, like, for example, you're going to start the discussion today in terms of a policy with respect to additional earnings credit and with respect to how to
Oh, I
conduct
see. So
valuations. As those are
those
adopted,
would-
we'll
got it.
incorporate those
Got
into
it.
this as
Great.
well.
Thank you.
Well, we're just trying to be as meticulous on the benefit side as we are in other decisions you make as a board. We decided there was a deficit here in the board of governance.
Makes
around
sense.
benefits.
Makes sense.
And
Thank you.
it's part of the ongoing review of what our board policy book actually contains. In board governance, we had a conversation about, and maybe this isn't the best way to put it, having the policy and then the plan document as an appendix or something like that. So actually maybe the procedures. Are we thinking about keeping the procedures of how we do it as opposed to the policy of doing it separated?
Yes, I'm not sure what would be the procedure, and then looking at any of these things, what the procedure would be other than the value. Go ahead.
You know, I think the distinction might be, Dana, on the compensation issues, to use that word procedures, those are still board-approved procedures, so we
Right.
can't take those, and I can't change anything in those.
Correct.
You retain the powers over those. The language you have before you is only speaking to the decision of the board, really. The mechanics that Rick Reed or others might do to implement that aren't part of a board activity. So they wouldn't be in an appendix to the board policy.
They
That's
would
how I
stay
see
in
that
policy.
distinction, yeah.
All right.
That's why it's pretty narrow here, is we just want, when you make a decision, it's very clear where that links back to a board policy like
Right.
this. So I wouldn't see it as comparable to the comp issue where you retain all those powers all the way through the procedure implementation.
All right, thank you. That's exactly what I was talking about. Thanks. Go ahead, Ed.
No, that's it. I'm just happy to answer any questions, and if the
Any
board is
further-
comfortable with, or the committee's comfortable with proceeding with it, we can modify it, you can adopt it with the understanding that we would amend out the historical information, and it's just based on what the current.
Pleasure of
Policy
the
is.
committee. Is everyone okay with that? All righty, let's go that route then.
Okay, so.
Alrighty.
You, an action to adopt that?
So I'd entertain a motion to adopt that, the first reading of adding those rates and benefit amounts to our board policy manual.
First reading, or, I mean, it's gonna,
What is, it's before us for first reading, we can move it now.
okay. I'll make that motion.
Alrighty, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? A 30-minute agenda item done in 5. We're catching up.
Okay,
Alrighty.
this one will take a
Back
little
to you,
longer.
Ed. I feel better now.
Oh, good. See, glad we could help out. Let me bring up the Milliman gang for this one. This is a first reading, and just to be clear, we do not anticipate and are not recommending the board take action today. This is really meant to be the first discussion and to get some direction from the committee in terms of how you want to proceed. But when the board, as part of the evaluation process, discussed the additional earnings credit and the additional credits and additional annuity credits with respect to DBS and cash balance, there's a lot of discussion about the policy as the board currently has it and whether or not it should be modified in some way to address various issues. And given the changes that have occurred in the economic environment since that policy was adopted several years ago. So we requested Milliman to sort of take a look at the policy, look at perhaps some options of changes made to it, and in particular, what impact what the current policy is and potential alternative policies would have on the long-term funding of the DBS and cash balance program. So with that, let me turn it over to Nick and Mark, and they can sort of walk you through what their analysis consisted of.
Thank you, Ed. Good. Turning on the mic here. So first, I want to back up just a little bit and look at the overall idea of the policies, which we're going to be looking at with you. In good times, the policies allocate additional credits. They share the positive experience. Then in the bad times, what the policy is set up to do is credit a minimum interest rate based on the 30-year Treasury bill, which is less than the assumed interest rate, the idea being that in the bad times, by over the long term earning the assumed rate, we can make up time now, or make up funding. What we're going to be looking at with you today is the current interest crediting policy. So we're really looking at what do we do in the good times? How much interest do we credit when we have surplus? We are not focusing on the minimum interest rate. That's another issue which you may direct us to look at more seriously after we're done today. Specifically, we looked at how different variables in the interest crediting policy can be changed, how these are like levers that we can modify, which could change the future funding of the retirement system. We went through and did a stochastic analysis That means we ran the numbers through a random number generator, looked at 1,000 different scenarios to determine where we might be 30 years from now. Nick is going to spend quite a bit of time going over the details of that with you. But I want to point out that the one thing we found was there was a larger chance of underfunding in the future than we thought for this program. I'd say a material chance. It's been very resilient so far. We hope it will continue to be very resilient in the future. Good chance of that. But indeed, this is very timely for the board to be looking at this issue now, because there is still a chance, even with the resiliency of future underfunding. In addition, the last thing, as directed by the board at I think it was the previous board meeting, we're looking at the equity. How will changing some of these levers change the way in which the assets are distributed between different generations of members? So we're going to report back to you on that. So moving forward, or maybe backward, looking at background, we met last April to provide you with the results of the June 30, 2013 actuarial valuation. And at that time, we found that the defined benefit supplemental programs funding had increased, this is as of June 30, 2013, from 100.6% to 109.6%, and the cash balance benefit programs funding had increased from 100 to 110.5%. So there was discussion at that point about whether or not additional credits should be granted based on the funding of the system. Specifically, since one of the thresholds is based on being 106% funded, which was lower than in the past. It's based on that minimum interest rate, which since that's based on the 30-year Treasury bill, that's come down. Should that be modified? Well, the board decided to follow the board's policy at that time, which seems to be a reasonable thing, but before next April rolls around, to review the policy and see if the policy itself should be modified. Now, after the credits were granted last time, that brought the funding of the DBS program from 109.6 to 105.8%, and the cash balance benefit program went from 110.5 to 107.1. That was due to those additional credits being granted. Now, this is a chart showing the funding of both programs. They're very close. The two main things I want to emphasize here, first, the resiliency of the program. It's gone down as low as 80% and come back. That's partially because of good returns, partially because in the bad times it only credits a minimum interest rate based on the 30-year Treasury bills to the members. The other thing I want to emphasize here is that Nick's going to be looking at some stochastic projections, the percentage of the time the system is between 75% and 100%. Well, we can see that even recently, there's been a fair amount of the time that the system has been between 75% and 100%. It's been able to come back from that. One of the questions is, at what point is the funding so low that the chance of coming back is decreased to a point that we need to be concerned? So the goal of the current policy is to strike a balance between two things. First, we want to be responsible. The policy should not allocate so much to additional credits to significantly increase the probability that the funded ratio would fall below 100% in the future. We want to be responsible, but we don't want to be stingy. I couldn't think of a better actuarial term than that, but we don't want to be stingy. The policy should not be so restrictive that excessive surplus might be accumulated before the credits are declared. So to do that, the policy defines two thresholds. The first threshold is the point at which we credit the actuarial assumption. So for the defined benefit supplement program, that's 7.5%. For the cash balance program, 0.5% less, 7%. But at what point, instead of just crediting that minimum interest rate based on the 30-year Treasury bill, at what point are we going to credit the whole assumed rate? That's the first threshold. The second threshold says, well, if we have even more than that, at what point are we going to grant additional credits which are equal to 50% of the excess above that amount? And I'm going to look specifically at what those thresholds were last year with you right now. The first threshold is based on 2 times the minimum interest rate. Last year, the minimum interest rate had gone down all the way to 3%. 2 times that was 6%, which is in the middle of this slide. But first, I should have pointed out that the goal is to credit the whole 7.5% if possible. So we'd already credited 3.75. That was the minimum interest rate. It gets a little bit confusing because we look at 2 different years of the minimum interest rate. So first, we say, well, okay, we're going to credit the minimum interest rate for last year, which was 3.75% no matter what. We'd like to credit the entire assumed return of 7.5%. Well, if we were to do that, that would be 3.75% more than the 3.75% that we're already crediting from last year. But to determine whether or not we want to do that, we want to look at where we're going to be next year, or maybe it's this year, last year and this year. This year, the minimum interest rate had gone down from 3.75% to 3%. The first threshold is based on 2 times that minimum interest rate. 2 times 3% is 6%. The funding ratio was 109.61%, so there was a surplus or a gain-loss reserve of 9.61%. That was larger than the 6% first threshold, saying that up to 3.61% could be credited. That was not as large as the whole 3.75%, so the first allocation last year to the defined benefit supplemental program was 3.61. Now, I should point out, I'm only going to look at the defined benefit supplemental program with you. Cash balance program works almost identically, except instead of a 7.5% assumption, we have a 7% assumption. So that's the first allocation. Second allocation, we look at what's remaining. We'd spent the surplus down to 6% essentially. And we're going to compare that on the second threshold, not to 2 times the minimum interest rate, but 3 times. So 3 times the 3% is 9%. Well, if we've got 6% left and we want to see if we're above 9%, we're not. If we'd been above the 9%, then half of that, the amount remaining above 9%, would have been an additional allocation based on the board's interest crediting policy. So that takes us to where the funded percentages were at the end. So for the defined benefit supplemental program, the funded percent changed from 109.6% to 105.8%. Due to the policy, we're at the 3.61%. The way the math works out is if you increase by 3.61%, it actually takes you just below 6%. That's not something to focus on. That's not the material issue. The issue is what Nick's going to be talking to you about, which is what are the thresholds? How do we define the thresholds? We were asked some questions last time. One of the questions we want to make sure to respond to is what would happen if the high interest credits of the early 80s and the low returns from the 70s were to repeat. So this slide answers what would happen if the period from 1970 to 1984 was to repeat, what would happen to the funding status of the program, and what would happen is it would decrease, it'd bounce around, go down to somewhere under 80%, but then if we hit our assumption on a go-forward basis, 7.5% long-term compared to a minimum interest rate which might be around 5%, we'd make up room and we'd make up ground and we'd be okay. Well, that's okay. What if the same thing happened twice? What if the actual experience for investment returns and interest credits, based on the 30-year T-bill from 1970 to 1984 happened twice? Well, in that case, things would not be so good. Then we'd be down below 40%. As we look at this, we like to look at things from a statistical, probabilistic standpoint. And so what we did, as I said, is we ran things through a random number generator to find out what the probability of future events would be, which is the transition to hand it over to Nick to give you the really interesting stuff.
Yeah. And just to follow up on Mark says, I don't think Mark said that the 1970 and 1984 was a high interest rate environment, but the investment returns weren't bad. They were about 7%. But you really have 2 triggers that are affecting the funding of the cash balance and DBS program, and that's the interest credit that's going to the members and the investment return assumption. And as Mark said, we're going to kind of look at how that would impact it. So the first question is downside risk really a realistic concern? I mean, are we worrying about something it's never going to happen? Mark talked about there's definitely some resiliency, but being actuaries, we wanted to try and quantify this. So we did a stochastic analysis, as Mark said, and we did it on a DBS program once again. I'm sure you'd like to hear from us twice as long, and we could have done the CBB program also and told you pretty much the exact same thing, but we just focused our analysis on the DBS program. As Mark said, we did 1,000 investment scenarios. So we actually did 50-year projections, but we focused on the 30-year time horizon. And we did fix the minimum interest rate at about 5%. I talked to our economist and kind of what you expect from the 30-year treasury. We expected to go up a little bit. He was figuring 4.5% to 5% range might be a good long term. So we just used 5% just because it was easier just to kind of have one variable and reduce complexity a little bit. But we did look at the investment return scenarios. We based that on capital market assumptions that CalSTRS has to provide that estimate. Obviously, we looked at the current policy first, and Mark's views was don't be too stingy. And I said current policy does a good job of preventing hoarding of investments. Obviously, we don't know what the exact right number is on the funded ratio, but what we talked about in our letter was, well, we're pretty darn sure if we're keeping 150%, we're keeping too much money. But if we're down to 50% funded, we don't have enough money. Where the answer is in between that, we're not sure, but we kind of wanted to focus our analysis there. And the last thing is, Mark already alluded to this, there was probably, we were not surprised, but there was probably a little bit more susceptibility to downside returns than we were expecting. So, that is an issue we might want to revisit. It's not, obviously, we're not in that position right now. We always like to, look at these things ahead of time, so we're not responding in a crisis situation. But right now, as Mark says, the focus is on what to do when we're overfunded. So going to our pretty stochastic modeling graph here, we have funded ratios over 30-year period. So this is a funded ratio after 30 years. So we're at our starting point, and we ran these scenarios, 1,000 scenarios, and we kind of put the probability that they fell into each of the funded ratios. And you'll note the two things we were focused on was the red, which was less than 50% funded ratio. That's, I think red is an accurate color there because we get to a little 50% funded, we do have concern. And that was, like we said, a little higher, a little over 20%. The overfunded, the over 150% was very small, only about 2%, that blue right at the top. So you can see, obviously, it's, as I alluded to, it does a really good job of not holding too much money back, but there is some issues with downside. So the question is, what can we do looking at the upside scenario where we're crediting interest rates? How is that going to affect our downside that may happen in the future? Obviously, we know we're not going to earn 7.5%. Is giving away interest credits right now really increasing, creating this problem down below? So before I get into that, I put together this graph. I think Ed was really excited by it. It's like, but I think there's a couple key points here. One is, if you're over 115% funded, there's a very strong wind pushing down, because if we get over, and I used 115% funded using 5% minimum interest rate. Right now we were at 109%, but as soon as you get over that, then you're giving away 50% of the interest credit. So there's a very strong wind blowing down, and that is why that blue, where we talked about being over 150% funded, it's such a low probability, because once you get above that 3 times minimum interest credit, you're giving a large chunk of that money back. And that's the one thing that the top things there is meant to represent. The green area in there, the point, and Mark alluded to this, we're only crediting the minimum interest rate, which generally, except for maybe the late 70s and early 80s, is generally going to be, our investment return is going to be greater than our minimum interest rate. So we're going to be making up a certain amount because we're going to be crediting hopefully 7.5, and versus we're crediting 5 and earning 7.5 in a perfect world. So there's a slight breeze to push us up if we're in that position, but it does not always hold. Take, for example, if you were 50% funded and you credited, that means your account balances are basically twice what your assets are. Well, if you credited 5% on your account balances and credited 7.5 on your investment return, you're crediting 5% on twice as much. Effectively, you're crediting more than you're earning. So once you get down below, and I have a threshold of about 67%, that's what it is, at 5% minimum interest rate. But once you get down below whatever that number is, whether it be 50 or 60 or 65%, you're going to actually have sort of a breeze pushing you downward because you're going to be crediting more on the accounts than you're earning on the investment return. So this clearly is an area, and that's, we don't want to get to, and that's, as I talked about, we don't want to end up in this 50% funded ratio. So before I get in, we ran some specific alternatives. This was just a hypothetical example. What if we were the ultimate in stingy and we did not give anything back? Just as kind of our extreme case, could we completely solve any issues here? What you see is really we've lowered our red, by about half, but obviously we've created a huge probability, about 60% that we're over 50% funded. And I just go back to this, once you go 30 years in the future, we don't have a lot of steering as we go forward. If we look at the DB program, we now actually have some variability on our contribution rates. But before we had that fixed rate on the DB program, we go out 30 years in the future, we didn't know where we're going to be. Now we have a little bit of ability to steer with the contributions. Now on the DBS program and the CBB program, our steering is a little bit with the interest credits. We can kind of take our foot off the gas, so to speak, although we don't really have a brake, which would be the trying to address things if we were in a downside scenario. But the point here is obviously that because we're crediting less than we're earning, we'd expect to be well overfunded if we didn't give back these interest credits. So clearly we need to have some policy to give back to the credits. But what exactly it is, and now I'm going to look at three sort of examples. So basically you have three kind of key things that you can do. You can adjust who you give it to, which really is, your actives, your inactive people who aren't retired, and your retirees. You can adjust how much the credits are giving. For example, as we talked about, right now we're giving 50%. We're above that 3 times minimum interest rate. You could do less or more. And lastly is when the additional credits are granted. As right now we have that threshold of 2 times and then 3 times. And as you can see, we analyzed 3 alternatives. One was higher thresholds. That's our when. One is credits to, we just said, okay, we're going to not give credits to the retired members. And obviously there's some issues with that, but just for an illustrative purpose to kind of see that. And we'll talk about why sort of from our actuarial perspective, it's not quite clear to us that we want to give these credits to the retired members. And lastly, looked at a lower investment return assumption. That's another way we can adjust how much because you're setting a lower target. Like the CBB has a slightly lower target than the DBS, so you're giving lower interest credits. Alternative 1 is higher thresholds. As Mark talked about, the current policy does 2 times the minimum interest rate, and so our first threshold was 6%. So we could raise the threshold, and that would build more of a gain-loss reserve. You think about there's a number of scenarios. One is you have a lot of gains, and then you have losses, which is this is when the interest credit policy kind of has the biggest impact because if you have gains and you're effectively going to give some of that away, then you have losses. How much buffer do you want to maintain? So that's if we give away more, then that's going to obviously increase our probability of being less than 100% funded. On the flip side of that, if we set a higher threshold, then we're going to have less probability of giving away the interest credits, and therefore you're going to have a higher probability of being over 150% funded. And then the worst scenario is you just have losses followed by losses, and then you wouldn't even have to worry about your interest crediting policy when you're over 100% funded. So one of the things I know, I think it was Mark's idea, although somebody else might have thought of it, but I mean, he felt strongly about this, and I agree. There's some rationale to tie the threshold to your standard deviation of your investment portfolio, because your standard deviation of your investment portfolio is kind of measuring the variability of your returns. And obviously, if you have high variability of returns, you probably want to have a slightly more conservative or a higher threshold before you give them away, because there's there's a high probability you're going to get a high return, but also a low return. So we used the standard deviation of about 14%, and then we used this. Then we sort of applied the same policy. Well, it was similar policy. With the first threshold, we used 14% of one standard deviation, and the second threshold of 28%. And we did the same thing where we granted up to 7.5% after the first threshold, and the second threshold we gave away 50% at that point.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that one of the things I like about using the standard deviation is it directly reflects the risk-reward relationship. We all know that to get more reward, you tend to want to take more risk, but that means you may need to hold more in reserve in that case. And also to emphasize that a one standard deviation event is a one standard deviation downward event is going to happen approximately 1/6, 1 out of every 6 years. So it gives you an idea of the risk that's being taken. Two standard deviation event, much less likely to happen. That's only about a 2.5% chance.
So this is the results on the higher thresholds. What you see is a drop in the red, not a huge drop, but not an immaterial drop. And obviously the flip side of that is now we have a higher probability of being over 150% funded, and this is the trade-off that Mark talked about when he's talking about striking the balance. Pretty much anything you do is you're going to have a hard time reducing the probability of being over 150% funded and reducing the probability of being less than 50% funded. So that the result is no surprise. And as we see, the other three alternatives, well, I guess this is the first, and the other two are going to be fairly similar results you'll see. Before I get into that, there's the second alternative. Excuse me, I was getting ahead of myself there. The second alternative is additional credits to non-retired only, and I want to talk about this a little bit because you've got your population of your folks in the cash balance and the DBS, and you have the folks. Oh, thanks, Mark. You have the folks who are active, the folks who are inactive, and the folks who are retired, and we have not treated them any differently in the current policy. Everyone get the fill up to the 7.5% of the first threshold, and then they get the extra piece once you hit the second threshold, and they get about 50% of that surplus. It's for giving to the retirees, just from our actual perspective, it's a little counterintuitive to us. Because what you're doing with the retirees is they have an account balance at retirement. Say it's $50,000, and then they convert it to an annuity, and now they're getting $500. How do we convert that to annuity? We say, well, what's the equivalent value of $50,000? And we say it's $500 for the rest of the person's lifetime, earning 7.5%. So you are effectively guaranteeing that person 7.5% interest when they retire. Now we're saying the first threshold we're filling up because we're looking back at the last year and said, what was the interest credit? And we're saying, well, you should get, if it was 3%, then you're going to give 4.5%. Well, to get them up to 7.5%. Well, to us, that makes a lot of sense from the actor perspective. Well, the retirees, you've just guaranteed that each year in the future they're get 7.5%. So they're effectively getting a higher return on their account. So effectively you end up with the retirees, they share in the good experience, but not in the bad experience. Now obviously this is, we're looking at this from an actual perspective. If this was something, shifting the who in the equation, obviously you wouldn't want to talk that over with legal and look at it, and would it only be future retirees, or would it be past and future retirees? Just for illustrative purposes, we've used past and future retirees to kind of show the maximum impact. And you can see there is definitely an impact with the red area dropping down significantly, about I think it was about 23 to about 17%. Really not much change in the probability of being overfunded. Obviously a desirable result, but obviously to get there might be some questions. So there's actually there's some other ways you could address this issue with the retirees, how to work the sharing or the sharing of the interest credits for them, and Mark is going to talk about one of those possibilities.
So what we did so far is we said, okay, the retirees can win but they can't lose. That doesn't seem right. We're going to give them a benefit which reflects 7.5% returns in all future years. Currently, we might give them additional annuity credits on top of that. So what we'll do is they can win, but they can't lose. Why don't we just take the additional annuity credits off of it? Then they don't win or lose. They just get a fixed benefit reflecting 7.5% returns in all future years. So retirees in that case do not share what we just looked at under alternative number 2, additional credits to non-retired members only. The retirees do not share in either the good or bad experience. Well, is there a way that we could make the retirees share in both the good and bad experience? Instead of sharing in neither, how about share both? Well, there are a number of ways, and this is one potential way that could be done. First, instead of calculating the initial monthly retirement benefit based on 7.5% future returns, why not calculate it based on what we think the long-term minimum interest rate will be? That's similar to what we're already going to guarantee the active members. Let's guarantee the retired members the same thing that we're going to guarantee the active members. So maybe 5%. I'm going to use that as an example since our economist thinks that long-term that might be the current minimum interest rate. Well, then in the first allocation, what the retirees would receive would be a fill-up from that 5% that was used to calculate their monthly benefit to the 7.5%, which we're assuming can be earned. So they would get an additional 2.5% in any year that we reach the first threshold. What would that mean in terms of the actuarial valuation? I'm sure you're interested, but of course we are extremely interested in what that would mean for the actuarial valuation. Well, we would be projecting out 7.5% assumed returns, which means that over the long term, we would think retirees would receive on average a 2.5% annuity credit every year, and we would reflect that in our valuation. We would actually be reflecting 2.5% increases for the retirees in each future year and then discounting them back at 7.5%. Turns out that's the same thing as reflecting no future increases and discounting them back at 5%, which is another way of saying there'd be no actuarial loss in the actuarial valuation when we converted their account balance into an annuity, into a monthly benefit based on 5% future earnings. Well, that means the retirees' benefits will reflect at least 5%. How can they, in this case, reflect the bad experience? Well, the bad experience for a retiree would be if they don't get those future 2.5% annuity credits. Similar to, for the active members, the bad experience is if they don't get anything above the minimum interest rate. What would happen inside of the actuarial valuation then is we would have been assuming a 2.5% increase for annuity credits in each future year. As an annuity credit was not experienced by the retirees, that would actually show up as a 2.5% reduction in the liabilities, which would be an actuarial gain, which would help us to catch up on the retirees in the same manner that we catch up with the actives. So what we end up with at the bottom line is that the retirees here are going to share in both the good and bad experience. So the first retiree alternative, they didn't share in either the good or bad experience. Here they share in both the good and bad experience, which is somewhat more consistent with the overall design of the defined benefit supplement and cash balance benefit program, the variable benefit structure where people do share in good and bad experience, which is part of the resiliency of the program. What the retirees would actually receive then is benefits which were based on the greater of either the actual returns or 5%. If the actual returns long term were lower than 5%, they would still receive that benefit which was calculated assuming 5% in all future years. If in fact the returns were better than 5%, then we would be projecting that they would receive annuity credits and that their benefits would reflect the actual returns of the fund. And the last bullet is an important one. It's easy to talk about things like this, and I personally think there's a lot to recommend them, but they require a lot of careful legal review. So with that, I'll turn it back to Nick to look at some more stochastic.
Nick, before you go, I have
Yeah.
a grant.
And Ed had his hand up too.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I just want to make sure that, I mean, clearly we'd want to obviously look at legal issues. I also want to make sure that the board is aware of the fact that under the statute, the granting of an additional annuity credit is permissive, even if an additional earnings credit is granted. So, I mean, I want to make sure it's clear that there is provisions in the law that allow for the possibility that there would be a different or a zero additional annuity credit. in the
Or, and a
case.
different methodology that the board.
Yeah, there's not, the law doesn't specify the methodology at all.
Right, Grant?
Couple of questions. Do we know the percentage of how many take an annuity
About half.
Okay. And then, just in terms of competitiveness, 7.5%, and with the option of having more, is that even among public cash balance plans, is that kind of unique, or is that?
That's a very good deal. Speaking as an actuary, if I could go out and purchase an annuity calculated at 7.5% returns with the potential of getting annuity credits based on actual returns in the CalSTRS portfolio over a 30-year T-bill, I would as an actuary, I'd buy as much of that as I could. It's a very good deal.
And then the other thing that I think when people purchase an annuity, they want to get rid of all risk. And that's what they're doing. So I'm wondering how that would, I don't know, but how members would react if you said you can purchase this annuity and your allowance may go up or down.
Well, their allowance would not go down.
Okay.
It would
Oh,
be,
but
it would
the-
be calculated, and that's a very important point. I'm glad you brought that up. It would be calculated initially, assuming 5%. To the extent that future returns were greater than 5%, it could go up,
They get
but
more.
it would never go down.
That's right.
And once it had gone up by 2.5%, it would stay up that 2.5%. It wouldn't go down after that either. The reason that in terms of the actuarial valuation, there's a gain is that we're already assuming there will be a 2.5% increase. You could think of it as a 2.5% COLA, but it's an annuity credit. We're assuming that in each future year in our valuation. To the extent that it doesn't actually happen, it shows up as a gain, as a way for us to make up ground on funding.
But does it change the election behavior? I think we need to come back to that point. If it's 50-50 now, and if someone could understand this and make the right decision, would that suddenly change people's desire to have an annuity? I mean, is that a desirable value? Is that something we should be thinking about? I mean, the math's wonderful, but is that the behavior we're looking for?
It's
mean-
very difficult to encourage people to purchase annuities in the first place. So the fact that purchasing an annuity at 5% is currently good, maybe not so good in the future, doesn't get around the fact that people may still be reluctant to purchase annuities at a lower rate from CalSTRS, even if they do have the potential for future annuity credits. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, and just for reference, I mean, if you had $1,000 annuity and you were purchasing it at 5% at 7.5, I mean, maybe it's, like $800. So it's not an imperceptible thing that the members wouldn't see.
Not imperceptible.
Not, yes.
That's the way actuaries talk.
Just want to make sure I heard that correctly. So it would make a big difference. Is that what you're saying?
It is perceptible.
big difference.
Yes.
Paul?
So the way you're describing this is that it would start out at a 5% annuity, but whenever it kicks up to something higher, it would stay there forever.
Yes.
So based on 1 year of experience, it could go up
It's
and
just,
stay there forever?
sorry, it's like a CPI COLA. It'd be like, you're getting $1,000 and then the CPI is 2%. Then you're getting 1,020, but if CPI is 0 the next year, then you're getting 1,020. It's only gets bumped up, in the year. It gets bumped up that additional piece. Is that where you?
To get a little
Right,
bit.
but we're not talking about CPI, we're talking about
Yeah, it is
a
effectively.
very volatile, I mean, that makes sense if you're talking about CPI where we generally don't have deflation. But here we have a standard deviation of 14%. So if we have one good year, it goes above 5% and stays there despite the fact that we still have 14% standard deviation on the underlying investments.
What it's trying to do is give the retirees the same deal the actives are getting. Currently, the active account is increased by the difference between 7.5 and 4, let's say, a 3.5% increase, and then the active account stays up for all time by that 3.5% increase. If there's a low return the next year, they're still going to get the minimum interest rate. That 3.5% increase isn't going to be taken away from the active. So for the retirees, they don't have an account anymore, they have a stream of monthly benefits out into the future. If we're going to increase the value of those monthly benefits by 3.5%, the way we do is by increasing it in every future year, not just next year, but if they're still alive 20 years by now, increase them all by 3.5%. And that's not going to be taken away from them any more than it would have been taken away from the active account. So it's really trying to reflect the same thing.
And they would have to
And-
get that 2.5% credit every year to take that 5% conversion to be equivalent to a 7.5% conversion.
And so there would be no cap on this. I mean, presumably it could start paying 10% or 12% or 15%.
The idea would be to make the first allocation something similar to this. It would be the difference between whatever the annuity was originally calculated at, say 5%, and the assumed investment return rate. So that matches the active first allocation. If we were fortunate enough to get to the second allocation, it would be the same as the active allocation. Say we had an extra 10%, and so half of that was given away 5%. Well, then active accounts would go up by an additional 5%, retired benefits would go up by additional 5%, which is exactly what happens right now. On the second allocation actually wouldn't be changed for retirees.
What do you think this fares on a communication basis to the members?
Asking an actuary for a communication. But I think you have to be very careful about how you put it forward on a communication basis. I don't think it's trivial, but I think there is a fairness issue here, which I think most of the people involved would understand. Frankly, I'm a little bit concerned that if people really understood how good of a deal they're getting right now was, if that was really communicated, the system might be hurt by having a larger number of elections and having more retirees than potentially getting the upside without the downside. Communication's, I think, a big issue.
I mean, I guess my concern is there are, you know, we know that we have a fairly risky long-term portfolio to get to 7.5%. I wonder what happens if people start realizing that actually CalSTRS is paying a 10% annuity. I mean, it's just, you know, it's yeah, it's a great deal for the members. I agree. I mean, I'd buy as much of such annuity as I possibly could. You know but I'm wondering, is it that the yield goes up, or is it that no? I mean, can it be described as really because it's neither the yield nor it's just a stream of payments, right? I mean, that's what an annuity is. It's just a stream of payments, and so we're saying the stream of payments goes up. There's not really a yield on it because there's not really a balance, an account balance. And if there is, why don't we just increase the account balance rather than the yield on that account balance? I mean,
There's a stream of future payments, and the actuary puts a price on it. So to the extent we increase that stream of future payments by any specific amount, say 2%, the value the actuary puts on it will go up by 2%. I think the other thing on a communication standpoint, reflecting on that too, is that people aren't forced to take this. If they think it's a bad deal, they can take the money and they can go out anywhere else they want and purchase an annuity or spend it as they choose. It's not a mandatory thing, and to me at least, that makes a difference.
Ed?
Yeah, I just had a question really for Mark, because the way the law reads now and the way it's been done, obviously, is that they basically, if we declare additional annuity credit, basically they get a check for the value of that credit based on the balance of credits in their account at the time of the declaration. So it's a one-time payment, and then that's it. So, but what you're suggesting is effectively, it sounds like taking that one-time payment and annuitizing that payment. Is that right?
Yeah, well, increasing the value of their benefits by the same amount that the active accounts would be increased.
But the present
percentage-wise.
value of
Yeah.
that increase is going to be the same as what it would be if it was paid in a lump sum like it is now?
I think that's right.
Okay.
Rick? And Tom, I'm going to come to you next.
So right now, we do essentially the same thing that they're saying, but we don't increase anybody's annuity. Say we get a 2% credit, we don't increase anybody's annuity. We take the present value of that annuity and create a one-time lump sum and increase that by whatever percentage. We don't re-annuitize, but we just send them a one-time check. So it's effectively the same thing, the same method that we've been using. Does that make sense? Does that confuse